لأجلك يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي، لأجلك يا بهية المساكن، يا زهرة المدائن، يا قدس يا قدس يا قدس يا مدينة الصلاة أصلي. عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم،
ترحل كل يوم،
تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
يا ليلة الإسراء، يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، وإنني أصلي. الطفل في المغارة وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان،
الطفل في المغارة
وأمه مريم وجهان يبكيان، يبكيان لأجل من تشردوا، لأجل أطفال بلا منازل، لأجل من دافع واستشهد في المداخل، واستشهد السلام في وطن السلام، وسقط العدل على المداخل.
Hello and welcome to our fourth panel on...
Wish it need to be in English.
Am I not in English? Hello and welcome to our fourth panel on the second day. Yes, this is the second day of the conference. Today we have a panel of esteemed experts. I want to introduce our moderator, Ms. Lamis Jamal Al-Ayan. She is an attorney and human advocate whose work involves matters ranging from freedom of speech, assembly, and worship. She also works on defending against state repression and predatory policies and surveillance. She has worked to decode and dismantle the unlawful secret demographics unit. She's helped to release those arrested in Egypt. She's also worked to protect international political prisoners. Lamis is an advisor on various charities, students, and academics in the US and UK. She's also worked to defeat transatlantic repression and militarization campaigns. She's been an advocate for the protection, equal protections in civil administration. She's a frequent lecturer on matters related to US foreign policy, Palestinians under law, refugees, international policing, and militarization. Ms. Lamis is also a member of the National Lawyers Guild, chief counsel to the Global Justice and Human Rights Network, and also an advisor to a number of Palestinian rights organizations. She is working internationally to advance investigative and prosecution strategies for international law violations and devising preemptive policies in this regard. Ms. Lamis Al-Ayan, the floor is yours. You're muted. Could you unmute your mic, please?
Thank you, Mr. Khan. Just to clarify, wassalamu alaikum, and good morning and good evening to all. To clarify, my name is Lamis Jamal Al-Ayan Deek, Lamis Deek for short. A special thank you to the Center for Islam and Global Studies and to our hero, my personal hero, Dr. Sami Al-Aryan, the force behind this conference for his lifetime of work and his work and CIGA's work here today. The session that I will be chairing is entitled Decolonizing Knowledge on Palestine, and it comes on the heels of one of the most powerful moments in the past 40 to 50 years of Palestinian history, i.e. the May 11th escalations, which gifted us the global adoption and resituation of colonialism as the framework for understanding Israeli violence and the Palestinian response. And as we know, the colonial colonial agenda for physical domination is preceded, sustained, and expanded by the control and domination of the psychological, pedagogical, cultural, historic, and political discourse. And so what will center today is the fact that the discursive struggle is neither abstract nor rhetoric, but a direct material centrality to devising and implementing strategies and policies for Palestinian liberation. I'll be introducing the speakers and their bios at the beginning of the session to allow for a more organic flow between the panelists. I also have the unenviable task of keeping time, so I ask for your forgiveness in advance should I interrupt anybody. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce and moderate this panel, because these panelists are those whom I would call the practical philosophers, whose work shapes their theories and their theories shape their work reciprocally, and I think are some of the most effective sorts of philosophers. Dr. Ahlam Muhtasib is a professor of media studies and the director of the Center for the Study of Muslim and Arab World at California State University, San Bernardino. She is the recipient of the 2020 CSU SB Outstanding Scholarship, Research and Creative Activities Award, and was one of the 2019 to 2020 Outstanding Digital Communication, Outstanding Research and Creative Activity Faculty Mentor Awardees. She has an MA in journalism, a PhD in digital communication from the University of Memphis, Tennessee, and her research interests include digital communication, social media, social justice, and diasporic communities. Her most recent project is her award-winning documentary, perhaps one of the most important, on Palestine, called 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. The film, co-produced and co-directed with Andy Trimlett, focuses on the year 1948 and its catastrophic consequences on the Palestinian people, which has originated from her fieldwork in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. She won the 2019 Rebuilding Alliance Storyteller Award, and the film has also won the Jerusalem International Film Festival's 2019 Special Jury Award in the featured documentary category. She currently works on a new documentary on 3 young Muslims who were murdered in Chapel Hill in 2015 and the state of racism and Islamophobia in the United States. Joshua Rubner is an adjunct lecturer in Justice and Peace Studies at Georgetown University and is beginning his PhD in Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter. He is the author of Shattered Hopes: Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace and of Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State. He's a former analyst in the Middle East Affairs at Congressional Research Service and holds a graduate degree in international affairs from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Sha'wan Jabarin is the General Director of Al-Haq and the Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights. In 2011, Dr. Jabarin was appointed to the Human Rights Watch Middle East Advisory Board, and in 2013, he was elected as a commissioner for the International Commission of Jurists and re-elected as a member of the ICJ Executive Committee in 2018. He is a recipient of the Reebok Human Rights Award in 1990 for his defense of the freedom of expression and human rights. He received his BA in sociology from Birzeit University and an LLM in international human rights law from the National University of Ireland in Galway. He also served for several years as a part-time lecturer in human rights and criminal law at Birzeit University in Palestine. He participated in numerous international conferences on international criminal law and international human rights law around the world. Dr. Jabarin also took part in many graduate and advanced academic programs at the Columbia University in the USA and the University of Strasbourg in France. Abdullah Ma'ruf Umar, our final panelist, is an assistant professor of Islamic history at Istanbul 29 Mayıs University in Turkey. He holds a PhD in Islamic Jerusalem Studies from the University of Aberdeen in the UK. Interested mainly in cultural and historic studies with interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary ethos, Umar concentrates his research on 3 main aspects. First, historical development of the relationship between Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities since the 7th century. Second, studying the life and biography of the Prophet Muhammad in Arabic literature and his influence on the Arabic Islamic culture. And third, researching modern history of Middle East and world civilizations, relations, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. On that note, we turn it over to you, Dr. Ahlam Muhtasib, to launch this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lamise. I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? All right. So thank you, Dr. Sami. And it says unmute myself. I unmuted myself. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me and for this wonderful, creating this wonderful space, you know, by Dr. Lalian and CIGA for us all to congregate and have this amazing intellectual, these amazing intellectual conversations. So my topic is decolonizing knowledge on Palestine through media. Rereading Edward Said's Permission to Narrate this past week was eerily similar to reading about the latest Israeli assault on Gaza and the ones before it. The pattern is very similar and the silencing techniques are almost the same. If we substitute the dates and places in Said's piece from Lebanon to Gaza, from 1982 to 2008-9 or 2012-14, from the PLO to Hamas, for example, one would think that Said is still alive writing about what have been going on during the last few weeks in Gaza in 2014 or before. If we replace the McBride Commission report, for example, with the Gladstone report, the parallels are not coincidental. It has been part of the typical Israeli genocidal war against Palestinians that is dependent to a great extent on actual devastation or devastating wars with their technological superiority, land and resources theft, and many other mechanisms. But most importantly, these mechanisms of erasure are enabled by a hegemonic narrative perpetuated through social dominance. Through media dominance. Rereading Said provides us with a unique framework of analysis with a few valuable lessons to learn. Said talked about the enormous asymmetry, not only in military power, but also in terms of the death, destruction, and injuries. That's in 1982. In terms of asymmetry, he also talks about how a few poorly armed Palestinians holding the Israelis off from entering Beirut for 80 days. The Israeli conclusions about their wars as humane in both contexts. The Kahan report in 83, raising US aid levels to Israel since the siege of Beirut to a point where Israel received roughly half of the entire American foreign aid budget. The employment of Golda Meir's essentializing of Palestinians either as non-existent or as haters of their own children, which was used against me recently in an email addressed to the whole campus, my own campus actually, by one of the faculty members. So the employment also of the terrorism label that enabled shelling refugee camps in 82 and more recently. When Said talked about reducing the number of countries attending a UN conference on the question of Palestine in 1983 from 130 to 75 countries, reminded me of reducing the 20,000 protesters in LA on May 15th of this year to few hundreds by mainstream media. Blaming the media for being pro-PLO reminded me of accusing John Oliver or any media outlet that showed a molecule of a Palestinian narrative like the Hadid siblings of being pro-Hamas. Lastly, the almost total media blockade, and I mean mainstream media, of the Palestinian narrative replaced by the dominant terrorism one. At that time, Said explained, the basic line in that is that the media have taken liberties with language, that analogies between Warsaw and Beirut are wrong, that any images showing Israeli troops engaged in bombing plainly civilian targets are anti-Semitic, that the millions of feet of newsreel are less trustworthy than the impressions of supporters of Israel or of a supporter of Israel who spent a day in Lebanon touring the place as a guest of the Israeli army. Underlying all attacks on the media is the allegation that the PLO has intimidated or seduced journalists into partisan, anti-Semitic, and anti-Western attacks on Israel. He also explained how John Chancellor, a leading American television commentator at that time, who arrived in Beirut during the siege and witnessed the destruction brought about by the indiscriminate bombing that was taking place all around him, reported in full view of a vast national audience references to savage Israel, an imperialist state that we never knew existed before. Similar to the retraction of actor Mark Ruffalo's tweets accusing Israel of genocide, among other things, Said reported on Chancellor's retraction of his report the week before, that's in 1982. Said comments, far from just changing his mind from one week to the next, Chancellor unwittingly exposed the degree to which the structure of the evening news depends on ideas of reality determined by the political and social discourse already empowered outside the newsroom. So what's different this time? What is different is that in addition to Israel's failure to end the resistance in all of its forms, the Palestinian narrative as a site of resistance has been able to penetrate the dominance of the Israeli one. It might not have killed it yet, but it has been causing it too many injuries that are harder and harder to heal. In the rest of this presentation, I would like to share an analysis of the media landscape covering Palestine during the latest few weeks and give few examples of the digital decolonization of knowledge on Palestine, including my own experience. Said states, facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them. Such a narrative has to have a beginning and end. In the Palestinian case, a homeland for the resolution of its exile since 1948. He then goes on to explain that narratives also have to have authority. So how can we engage in narrative production and give those narratives authority when we lack access to the mainstream channels to dissemination of knowledge in the United States? I will start with my own humble experience that is still evolving, which started by asking the question, how can someone teach Palestine through film? Considering this and other questions in teaching about Palestine over the years has made me reflect on knowledge production in general and media production in particular. As an activist scholar, these ontological and epistemological questions have also made me think about teaching beyond the classroom, outside of institutional constraints. In her 2012 edition of Decolonizing Methodologies, Research and Indigenous People, Smith argues, institutions such as the academy and major funding agencies maintain and reinforce the idea that research is a highly specialized skill that by definition is developed and supported at a distance from the community. Reflecting on a critical pedagogical approach to teaching the multitude and not only the educated about Palestine has made me reconsider my whole approach to education, shifting it from media and knowledge critique to media and knowledge production. This is not a novel idea, of course. In an interview that I conducted with legendary filmmaker Qasim Hawal on April 11th of this year, he explained to me how he documented the Palestinian revolution in Lebanon daily and for years. Like every day he would go and film. And how he trained an army of assistants to make sure they capture the resilience of the Palestinian resistance and also the institution building that was going on in Lebanon at that time. He told me that they produced hundreds of reels that they managed to save until the Israelis eventually looted them. And the good news is that now they are actually reconstructing all of that digitally, as much as they could, of course. Recognizing this important aspect of knowledge production, I started with my co-producer Andy Trimlett my 14-year journey making a documentary on the Palestinian struggle, a film aimed at the average American audience used to escapism and happiness in cinema and accustomed to watching films with stereotypical Palestinian characters. It was a journey for me that started in 2003 with the conceptualization of a critical ethnography/documentary project in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and also Syria and Palestine, and which culminated in 2017 with the premiere of our documentary 1948 Creation and Catastrophe at the Arizona International Film Festival. The journey actually continued after that with screenings around the world, with a special focus on an academic domain of distribution, since we activist scholars don't have access to mainstream media. So the decision to move into that mode of knowledge production, while still humble and limited, made the difference between educating 20 students in class and educated thousands outside of it. Upon the free release of the film on Canopy platform during the first 2 months of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm talking last year, our distributor reported that we received up to 1,250 views a day during peak times, in spite of the fact that the Zionist lobby viciously attacked the film. And of course, those could mean, a class of 40 students or a class of 100 or 200 students, because Canopy is the platform, the academic platform of film. I believe the film's success, in spite of the hate campaign against it, stemmed from the fact that it followed a scholarly approach to film. It was void of the typical emotional rhetoric in similar films and followed a famous Paulo Freire's quote, "Narratives of liberation must not ignore the cultural particularism of their roots, yet at the same time they must not abandon the opportunity to coordinate on a global basis." We therefore let the historical facts in the film build the emotional repertoire among our audience without our own intervention. The film has been adopted in classes of history, geography, anthropology, Arabic studies, to name a few, and around the world. However, the recent events in the last few weeks made me rethink my approach one more time. During the last month, there was a surge in screening of the film globally, from the US to Rome to Lisbon to and Porto in Portugal, excuse me, to Australia, to a synagogue in the Bay Area, all in the United States, all resulted in probably hundreds of people watching it. However, one post by a Palestinian blogger slash influencer, I'm talking about Taha Subhi, Subhi Taha, of a short clip he edited out of our film of Uthman Aqal's narrative of eyewitnessing members of the Jewish militias of the Etzel throwing a Palestinian child into a burning oven in the main bakery of Deir Yassin during the massacre in front of his father, then throwing the father after him, generated close to 500,000 views in just 2 days, in addition to the thousands of comments, sharings, and other engagements, including by one of the Hadid siblings. Contrary to the myriad ways of decolonial methodologies that Smith lists in her book, many of us Palestinian scholars in the US still ascribe to a positivist colonial epistemic approach to knowledge production that we need to liberate ourselves from. Therefore, we hired, me and my partner, a social media publicist to create short videos out of the documentary to go online. Of course, then it would generate interest in the documentary itself in its full. One of the important sides of decolonizing knowledge on Palestine now is digital, especially social media, because it is a site that the Israelis are still trying to reclaim, so far unsuccessfully. People and sometimes even scholars hold polarized perceptions about social media. Some believe in what we media scholars call technological determinism, which essentializes social media as bad and dangerous, etc. Others believe in a utopian vision of social media and how great they are for decolonizing, for democratizing knowledge production and information sharing. However, the reality is more complicated than this dichotomy and is more dynamic also. It keeps on changing. It is a new frontier of the battle between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic forces. While social media allowed activists new avenues and spheres of speech and expression that bypass traditional media gatekeepers, including user-generated content and sharing of vital organizing and planning efforts, giant social media corporations like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and to a lesser extent, TikTok, have reproduced similar power dynamics online to those that all traditional media have developed to keep control over journalistic content. A major obstacle for bloggers and online activists is, of course, social media algorithms and AIs, or artificial intelligence, which were originally created for a different utility, which is organizing content on these platforms when they exploded with users. Close to 3 billion Facebook users currently, which is close to half of the world's population. On the other hand, activists seem to be more informed on how social media algorithms that have been used in silencing and censoring Palestinian voices work, and they have been very creative in gaining access using genius techniques. One way of digital resistance for some Palestinian bloggers, influencers like Muna Hawa, was to group their followers using Instagram Live. Hawa, who has over 800,000 followers now, has been reporting live from Sheikh Jarrah, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Gaza, and other parts of Palestine through an intricate network of citizen journalists on the ground. Some of them are bloggers themselves with their own followers. In addition, she has been live streaming in coordination with other famous Arab bloggers and even American ones like one of the Hadid sisters to combine her followers with theirs, forcing Instagram to trend their live streams. Although she reported at one point that some of her live streams had been interrupted and taken down more than once. One of her live streams that I actually was watching live during the third week of May had over 140,000 live views, which could be compared to the viewership of some of mainstream media outlets. On May 24th, her Insta live stream with Muna Al-Kurd, who has over 1.6 million followers herself on Instagram alone, and other influencers generated 246,000 views. Another important example is that of the Hadid celebrity children or influencers, children of Muhammad Hadid. Gigi Hadid has 66 million followers, while Bella Hadid has about 42 million followers, And if combined with their brother's followers and Dua Lipa's followers, who's the brother's girlfriend and a singer, who has actually 68 million followers herself, we're talking about media power that surpasses that of any major media institution, or even, several media institutions together globally, even if we have overlap in terms of the followers. For example, CNN averaged 412,000 total day viewers aged between 25 and 54 years in 2020, last year. In addition, it is important to note that we are talking about the energy of the youth who constitute the majority of social media users. Therefore, Al-Auda's president, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition in the US, Amani Barakat, reported that as a result of Anwar Hadid's sharing of the announcement call for the May 15th demo and march in LA, they received 13,000 requests to join the listserv of Al-Auda in one day, and 6,000 responded to the call to action items, including a letter to Congress about Sheikh Jarrah, which might partially explain the historical attendance of the demo and march. It was estimated to be at least 20,000 by the LA Times and the organizers of the demo, in comparison to usually 100 or 200 people usually responding to such calls. Now, Israel has been attempting over and over to control the social media sphere, mainly through its cyber unit and in Gaza.
This meeting is being recorded.
They might actually consider that. What is more serious than this agreement and the constant collaboration with the Israeli government since then is the newest developments in such a relationship. For example, Politico reported on May 14th on the meeting that took place on the day before between executives from Facebook, Instagram, and even TikTok with Israeli Defense Minister Gantz. What is interesting is that Facebook announced that it would meet with the Palestinian side in a week. Why wait a week to meet with the Palestinians? That's the question. The ceasefire was expected to be reached by or even before then. So what's the point, right? They ended up meeting virtually with Palestinian Prime Minister Mohammed Shtayyeh and apologizing to him for deleting posts that used the hashtag Aqsa, Martyr, and Resistance, among others, and promised to fix the algorithm's error. I couldn't find if they actually acted on that promise or not, but that's at least one short success. It came actually just before announcing the ceasefire. Sometimes the devil is in the details. First, Facebook's meeting with Gantz also included the company's public policy director for Israel and the Jewish diaspora, which we don't have an equivalent as Palestinians. Her name is Jordana Cutler, a former advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Likud staffer. So Israel has already planted a very critical insider who would have so much control over content related to the whole region and beyond. Second, Facebook spokesperson Andy Stone said, in response to the violence, we are working to make sure our services are a safe place for our community. We will continue to remove content that violates our community standards, which do not allow hate speech or incitement to violence, and will proactively explain and promote dialogue on these policies to policymakers. He doesn't elaborate on what constitutes hate speech or incitement, etc. Actually, if we dig deeper, we find a very troubling trend in some of their definitions. The Intercept on May 14th reported on Facebook's secret rules on the use of the word Zionism and Zionist, which are beyond alarming. While the Intercept did a good job at tracking the history of the censorship, how it operates, and the potential ramifications of this policy, it failed to focus on a very dangerous adoption by Facebook of equating Zionist with Jewish and Israeli. And not only this, but actually stating frankly that they equate criticism of Israelis with criticism of Jews, thus claiming anti-Semitism, of course, in both cases. For example, spokesperson Claire Lerner said, "We allow critical discussions of Zionists, but remove attacks against them when context suggests the word is being used as a proxy for Jews or Israelis, both of which are protected characteristics under our hate speech policy." The Intercept did not challenge this admission of removing posts that attack Israelis. This is the clearest evidence that Facebook actively silences any criticism of the state of Israel, which is unfathomable. Not only on Facebook, but all other proxy platforms like Instagram. In addition, how can someone criticize the Israeli ethnic expulsion of Palestinians from their homes that will be handed for free, literally, to Jewish settlers. How can we avoid the use of the word Jewish in this case when that's exactly what Israel is doing? Palestinian activists have been educating the masses, especially their supporters, on how algorithms work and giving them advice on how to beat or outsmart the algorithms, such as coding keywords that might be picked by the algorithms, avoiding commenting on Israeli trolls posts so they won't trend, etc. Actually, also very important, hashtags later on enabled Facebook and Instagram to actually fish activist posts, so they stopped using them or changing them. However, not all posts get deleted by algorithms. There is also a human element in the decision-making process. For example, Facebook still use low-paid contractors around the world left to delete or preserve posts through a mix of personal judgment calls, some loose rules, flowcharts, and hypothetical examples. If you want to see more on this, actually the Intercept's article is a must for anyone who wants to understand this issue of social media censorship. In addition, Israel employs hundreds, if not thousands, of digital trolls whose mission is to locate posts sympathetic to Palestinians and reporting on them using the application act.il in masses, so those posts get flagged by social media platforms immediately. There is the war on the ground and there is the war in cyberspace, obviously. In spite of all of this suppression and censorship, the pockets of digital resistance are too many to count, and their manifestations are too varied to cover. Take, for example, Roger Walters' strong rejection of Facebook money and his team when its head Zuckerberg attempted to buy the license to use one of his songs for a Facebook commercial last week. To summarize, money and influence tilt the power dynamics in favor of Israel in general. But the dedication of Palestinian cyber activists and their supporters, motivated by their strong belief in the justice of their cause, manages to break through, not only in digital spaces, but in mainstream media ones as well. They no longer could ignore someone like Muhammad al-Kurd or the stories documented by Palestinian citizen journalists on the ground like Muna al-Kurd exposing the colonial logic of her neighbor, the thief, when he simplifies the knowledge in one sentence: if I don't steal it, someone else will. A look at the mainstream media coverage post the ceasefire in particular shows the dent they have been able to make. The change is happening incrementally and slowly but steadily. Palestinians are reclaiming the narrative and they are practicing digital decolonization through outsmarting the colonial, imperial, and capitalist powers behind social media. Thank you. More after I conclude the study I'm conducting right now on this issue. Sorry if I went too
Great
long.
work. Great work. I just wanted to make sure people can hear me, yeah?
We can't hear you.
I see that. Let me try.
No, I hear you well.
Oh, okay. Okay. So that's what I was wondering. I was trying to call time.
Ms. Lamis, I cannot hear you, by the way.
Okay, let me just make sure that
At
I'm
least
in
you're muted.
English. Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I think that was the issue. My apologies for that. I think it can't be understated the magnitude of the victory that you, Dr. Muhtasib, and other digital activists have secured in the face of perhaps what is one of the world's most powerfully fortified walls of censorship. And I would take it a step further and say it's not simply that Israel has taken liberties with language, as Dr. Edward Said said. I'm told that my camera is not on, but it is on. Does everybody see my camera?
Yes, your camera is on.
Oh, okay.
I can see you.
Somebody just sent a message. But really, rather, it's not just merely taking liberties, but there was a conscious decision to build and turn over a monopoly of power to the Israeli colonizer to define the colonized, and thereby to define our humanity and our rights and the very spaces that we physically inhabit. And this was escalated primarily when the US government intervened and built these forms and the tools for Israel to do so, beginning probably in the late 1960s. So it's a perfect follow-up to have Josh Rubner intervene at this point and talk about the historic context of what we assume to be immovable U.S. policies, but which existed in different forms previously. Turn it over to you, Josh.
Thank you so much, Lamis, and thanks so much to the Center for Islam and Global Affairs for organizing this really important conference. It's really truly an honor to participate with such esteemed panelists who are making such important contributions to the knowledge production that Dr. Muhtasib just described so beautifully, and also to advancing Palestinian rights on the ground. You know, ever since the first Zionist Congress took place in Basel, Switzerland in 1897, the Zionist movement has always sought the power and protection that comes with having a great power benefactor. So we saw that Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, actively sought the support of the Ottoman Empire for a land grant to the Zionist movement up until World War I. Of course, we all know that in the course of World War I, Great Britain promised the Zionist movement exactly what it wanted through the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And this pledge through the Balfour Declaration formed the umbrella under which the Zionist movement built the institutions in Palestine from 1917 all the way up until the White Paper of 1939 that really created the infrastructure for the Nakba of 1948 and the takeover of the land by the State of Israel in 1948. But even as the Zionist movement was cultivating Great Britain as its main great power benefactor, it was simultaneously cultivating the United States as a benefactor as well. And that cultivation as well goes back to the First World War, as I'll discuss in just a few minutes. But especially during World War II, when it became clear that the sun was setting on the British Empire and that the United States would be the key imperial player in the aftermath of World War II, the focus of the Zionist movement on the United States as its great power benefactor really intensified, and we see the intensification of this reliance of Israel on the United States even until today. Now, as a settler colonial movement that seeks to displace and eliminate the indigenous, the Zionist movement is no different from any other settler colonial movement. And the backing of a great power benefactor has really been the sine qua non, in other words, the precondition for the success of a settler colonial movement. So whether we look at Great Britain in North America, Spain and Portugal in North and South America, the Dutch in South Africa, Great Britain in Australia, France and Algeria, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we see how the settler colonial society is dependent upon great power support in order to implant itself upon the indigenous population. And so until the settler colonial society is successful in displacing and eliminating the indigenous and feels like it can stand on its own 2 feet, it maintains its reliance on this great power support. But despite the fact that we've had 140 years of Zionist colonization of Palestine, including 73 years of the ongoing Nakba, Zionism and the State of Israel have not succeeded in standing on its own 2 feet yet. In other words, the Zionist movement in the State of Israel has not and will not succeed in eliminating the indigenous Palestinian population. So therefore, Israel maintaining the steadfast backing of the United States is really of paramount importance for the continuation of the Zionist colonization project in Palestine. Now, after the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel on May 21st of this year, at first glance, it would seem that U.S. support for Israel is as, quote, unshakable and unbreakable as the mantra would have you believe in terms of U.S. political discourse. On the one hand, we see that the entirety of the Republican caucus in Congress continues to give Israel carte blanche to commit war crimes and to demonize the Palestinian people as subhumans who are undeserving of human rights, which, by the way, is an ethos that fits very well with the increasingly brazen white supremacist nature of the Republican Party. But the Biden administration and the majority of Democrats in Congress, while they eschew the more blatantly racist discourse of the Republicans, nevertheless are also absolving Israel by claiming that whatever Israel does is quote unquote in self-defense, and that whatever Palestinians do is quote unquote terrorism. And the Biden administration, which has made a big deal about its so-called commitment to base its foreign policy on values of human rights, has irredeemably revoked its right to say that this is the case, because it prevented the Security Council from imposing a ceasefire on Israel. And we also saw how the Biden administration rushed through a $735 million weapons deal to resupply Israel with joint direct attack munitions, or JDAMs for short. These were the same type of munitions that were found in the rubble of the Rimal massacre in Gaza City, the single deadliest incident of the latest fighting, which killed 43 Palestinians, including 22 members of the same family, the Al-Khawlaq family, who range in age from the 89-year-old patriarch of the family, Amin, to a 6-month-old great-grandson, Qusay. Meanwhile, most Democrats and Republican members of Congress are really tripping over themselves to secure $1 billion for the Iron Dome batteries for Israel, which is an anti-missile system that's over 90% effective, according to the Israeli military, which further tilts the calculus on the use of force further in Israel's benefit. So looking at this picture, if you're the Israeli government, or if you're an advocate in the United States on behalf of Israel, then you have to feel pretty good about this overall dynamic in the United States. But just as the shifting of tectonic plates are not felt above ground until there's an actual earthquake, major shifts in US public opinion and US politics are underway, and they're already producing very sizable tremors in the United States. So over the past 2 months in Congress, we've seen 3 incredibly important initiatives. Number 1, Representative Betty McCollum introduced a bill that would prohibit the US from funding Israel's demolition of Palestinian homes, detaining and ill-treating Palestinian children, including torturing them, and annexing Palestinian land. This bill now has 27 co-sponsors. Number 2, Representative Marie Newman led a letter that was signed by 24 of her colleagues to the State Department to prevent, in their words, Israel from committing the war crime of expelling nearly 2,000 Palestinians from their home in Jerusalem, which is an ongoing issue of concern. Number 3, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders introduced what was an unprecedented joint resolution to stop the sale of these JDAMs that I mentioned before to Israel. And this was a resolution that was signed by 14 co-sponsors. Now, a few years ago, if you would take any one of these 3 initiatives, they would have signaled a vast breakthrough in US policy in support of Palestinian rights. But when you take them together in their totality over the course of 2 months, they signal a vast potential shift that's underway in US policy. So what is undergirding this progressive democratic support that we're finally seeing in Congress for Palestinian rights? We are seeing a concomitant rise in support of Palestinian rights in US public opinion. Let me cite just 5 examples for you. Number 1, in May 2021, last month, Data for Progress showed that 72% of Democrats support the McCollum bill that I mentioned to prohibit US aid to Israel in certain circumstances, and only 15% of Democrats opposed the bill. A Gallup poll from 2021 found that liberals in the United States, not to mention progressives, but liberals, sympathize more with Palestinians than with Israel, 44 to 36%. The University of Maryland had a poll in 2020 which found that 48% of Democrats support the Palestinian-led movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, whereas only 15% of Democrats oppose BDS. The Brookings Institute in 2019 found that 66% of Democrats support sanctioning Israel or even stronger measures if Israel's colonization of Palestinian land continues, while only 31% think that opposition should be rhetorical only or do nothing about it. And then finally, one more poll. Brookings in 2018 found that if a two-state resolution was not feasible, then 78% of Democrats support a one-state resolution based on fundamental notions of equality between Palestinians and Israelis, whereas only 12% of Democrats would support the current status quo, which is a one-state apartheid reality. Now, in the United States, the demographic tide is shifting to make it extremely difficult for the GOP to win national elections on their white supremacist platform. This is why we're seeing states and federal level attempts by the Republican Party to restrict voter rights, to restrict access to the ballot box, because they know that they don't have a formula for winning national elections. So this is a very bleak outlook for Israel and its supporters in the United States, because Israel has become a Republican cause célèbre. And Democratic public opinion is extremely clear from all of these polls and many more. Democrats support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. They sympathize with the Palestinian cause. And in the absence of the possibility of there being a two-state resolution, they support one state based on equality. These are extremely important cracks in the so-called unshakable, unbreakable relationship that supposedly exists between the United States and Israel. But it's ahistorical and an example of presentism to project backwards in time what we see as today's unshakable, unbreakable relationship. And I think it's necessary for us to recover and reinterpret historical US objections to Zionism and the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine in order for us to see the potentialities of a future just US policy. So let me give you just 3 examples. As early as 1919, US policymakers understood that Zionism could only be implemented through the use of force over and against the unanimous objection of the indigenous Palestinian people. This is what the King Crane Commission and report found, which was a commission sent by President Woodrow Wilson to Palestine, to Syria, to Turkey in the aftermath of World War I during the Paris Peace Conference. Let me quote to you from a telegram that this commission sent to President Woodrow Wilson in June 1919. Quote, "Both Muslim and Christian take a united and most hostile attitude toward any extensive Jewish immigration or toward any effort to establish Jewish sovereignty over them. We doubt if any British or American official here believes that it is possible to carry out the Zionist program except with the support of a large army." So we see that the US had a foreknowledge of the fact that the implementation of the Zionist program in Palestine would only be accomplishable by force. Now, during most of the interwar years, when Great Britain held the mandate over Palestine, the US was primarily content to defer toward Great Britain, but as it became clear during World War II that the United States would be taking a leading post-war role in the new international order, the United States began to implement its own policies toward Palestine and other countries as well. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the president during World War II, sent out a personal representative to the Near East. His name was Brigadier General Patrick J. Hurley. He made a several-month-long tour all the way from Morocco in the west to Iraq in the east in May of 1943. And here is some of the conclusions that Hurley came to as a result of his mission on behalf of FDR. Here's what he said about Zionism. Quote, "The Zionist organization in Palestine has indicated its commitment to an enlarged program for 1, a sovereign Jewish state, which would embrace Palestine and probably Transjordan. 2, an eventual transfer of the Arab population from Palestine to Iraq. And 3, Jewish leadership of the whole Middle East in the fields of economic development and control. On the other hand, here's what he said about the Palestinian national movement. Quote, among the Arabs, there is little or no anti-Jewish sentiment as we ordinarily use the term, nor is there serious opposition to the concept of the Jewish national home. There are racial relationships between the Arab and the Jew, but notwithstanding these factors, there is deep-seated Arab hostility to any immigration program intended to create a Jewish majority in Palestine and to the establishment of a Jewish sovereign state. So from this, we know that the US understood that Zionism was opposed by the indigenous Palestinian population and that its success necessitated the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population. Now, before I wrap up, let me share with you one more very crucial memo from the archives of the United States. Just a few months before the UN adopted its infamous partition plan in 1947, Lloyd
If you could summarize it, Josh, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Lloyd Henderson, the director of the State Department's Office of Near East and African Affairs, wrote a memo in July 1947. And in light of the Human Rights Watch report, in light of the B'Tselem report on Israeli apartheid, I think this memo makes for extremely important reading. So here's what Henderson said in summary. Palestine should neither be an Arab state nor a Jewish state, but a single independent state in which all of its people of whatever religion or blood may dwell together in concord. The government of Palestine should represent all Palestinian citizens and should protect their human rights and fundamental freedoms. There should not be set up one system of law for the adherence of one religion and a different system for the adherence of another. And the immigration laws of Palestine should not discriminate against prospective immigrants on grounds of religion or blood. So as we see in summary, the breakdown of the two-state paradigm as a possibility that anyone believes in anymore, Henderson's remarkably forward-looking memo could easily be dusted off the shelf today to serve as a model for what a decolonized and democratic Palestine would look like. So far from this narrative of unshakable, unbreakable, continuous support for Zionism, we see that US policymakers actually understood very well the implications of Zionism. And these 3 reports that I referenced that were written 75 to 100 years ago show the way and point the way forward to a potential just US policy.
Thank you, Josh. And I'm sorry again to interrupt you. That was a brilliant presentation. I would just add that, you know, the US, not just in policy, but even in practice into the 1950s, was negotiating with the International Red Cross the release of Palestinians held captive out in the elements in camps outdoors in the 48 territories. Into the 1960s, we're negotiating via the UN CCP the repatriation and release of stolen Palestinian funds. And I think the biggest takeaway, for me, one of the biggest takeaways from your presentation is that what we're seeing in the US is rather a radically violent shift of US policy and practices towards Palestinians. And what, you might want to consider, later, whether for this webinar or not, to add to the discussion is the contradiction in the fact that the Democratic administration's Department of Justice, Democratic administration policing and prosecution tends to be more escalatedly repressive than Republicans against Palestinians domestically. And while this, oh, sorry, I just saw a message come in. While this is not merely an intellectual exercise, but rather, which is important, but rather is an exercise that is aimed at devising, inspiring, and guiding the work in solidarity with Palestinian liberation outside of Palestine, but also the work for Palestine inside of Palestine. And to follow up on this is another Palestinian hero, a hero of mine, Dr. Sha'wan Jabarin, who can expand more on this level amongst others. Thank you, Dr. Na.
Thank you, Lamis. I'm not a doctor. I have no PhD.
All the same to me.
No problem. I would like to thank CIGA for organizing this great conference. And it's a great honor to be with distinguished panelists in this panel. I don't want to go into technical things regarding, human rights and international law for human rights or humanitarian law. But I would like to start like this. During the past months, the Palestinian people have forced the world to open their eyes to their oppressive reality. Sparking from Jerusalem, the epicenter of Palestinian resistance, Jerusalemite youth of Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood started mobilizing to prevent their forced expulsion from their homes and favor of settlers organizations. Born refugees, they have been engaging in illegal battle since their birth with the state institutions, settler organizations, and the discriminatory judiciary, which illegally implements Israeli domestic law in an occupied territory. Sheikh Jarrah youth, who were brought up on their grandparents' memories of displacement and dispossession of the Nakba, discovered early in their childhood that this is their reality too. For that, they wanted to stop what is a motto in a Palestinian reality, the ongoing Nakba. Such reality is exemplified in the ongoing denial of millions of refugees their inalienable right to return to their homes and the systematic policies and measures Israel has designed and implemented since its establishment to forcibly displace more and more indigenous Palestinians. The mobilization effort to save Sheikh Jarrah on social media and on the ground coincided with Israel's attacks and intimidations against Al-Aqsa Mosque and Damascus Gate during the holy month of Ramadan. This sparked confrontations between youth-led, popular, and unarmed protests against the Israeli heavily armed forces. Soon enough, the fictional fragmentation Israel has vigorously worked on for the past 73 years against the Palestinian people began to fade away. Palestinians in the besieged Gaza Strip, in the occupied West Bank, in annexed Jerusalem, inside the Green Line, and as refugees and exiles, united in what became a popular uprising. Driven by a high spirit of hope as well as a spirit of frustration and anger of the denial of their basic and inalienable rights and the lack of genuine political representations, Palestinian youth chanted again ethnic cleansing in 2021. The youth also explained to the world the Sheikh Jarrah is only one manifestation of the historical and ongoing nature of the Israeli settler, colonial, and apartheid regime against the Palestinian people as a whole. Since its inception, Israel has invested in the policy of strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people as a main tool to entrench its apartheid regime, whether by denying the refugees their right to return to their homes, restricting the movement between Palestinians in historic Palestine, restricting the right to family life, isolating Jerusalem and imposing a severe closure on the Gaza Strip. In that, Palestinians find themselves in separate legal categories, geographically fragmented and unable to unite freely. And while the fragmentation policy aims to maintain an apartheid regime, it's also a tool to weaken the will of the Palestinian people, their national identity, and their capacity to exercise their inalienable rights as a people, including their right to self-determination and to challenge Israeli settler colonial regime. The popular protests, which were mostly youth-driven, also expressed the frustration from the internal political situation. The generation of the so-called peace process of Oslo Accords have seen nothing since their birth but ongoing international crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, like settlement expansion, ongoing denial of the right to return, movement restrictions, land confiscation, pillage of their natural resources, forcible displacement, house demolitions, killings, and the denial of their right to exercise their self-determination by Israel. On the other hand, they have seen the Palestinian leadership droning into the fiction of state building and division between Gaza and West Bank on the expense of their individual and collective rights. They have been also subjected to a new reality that their parents did not exemplify in a new level of human rights violations by their own governing authorities, including on their right to freedom of opinion and expression, their freedom of assembly and association, freedom from torture, and freedom from arbitrary arrests. And while the youth under the Palestinian political leadership remain absent from any political representation and participation, and lacking state institutions that are able to challenge Israeli expanding settler colonial regime, they have used their own tools to voice their aspirations to the world. The youth took it upon themselves to reclaim the narrative and to mobilize actions through social media, mass popular presence on the ground across historic Palestine, declaring a general strike supporting Palestinians' economy and building on their call to international community to impose sanctions on Israel. From false assumptions about Israel as an ordinary occupation, they told the world that Israel occupation is only but one symptom of its settler colonial endeavor. They outlined how this occupation is not ordinary, but an occupation that systematically violates its fundamental obligation as an occupying power by illegally claiming sovereign rights over the occupied territory, establishing an indefinite occupation, and acting in violation of the trust principles to serve the best interest of the occupied population. From false assumptions about the Israeli actions as defensive, they voiced the Israeli action as a tool to suppress and silence Palestinians, a struggle toward freedom, but it through the excessive and disproportionate use of force, the mass arbitrary arrests, sanctions, torture, collective punishment, intimidation, continuing killing of civilians and smear campaigns against the human rights organization, and even the suppression of social media content. From false assumptions about Palestine as a conflict situation which needs peace, they explain to the world that Palestine is under an ongoing Israeli settler colonial regime and needs freedom and decolonization. Not even the youth, but also children in the Gaza Strip talk to the media about their story. They explained to the world that 14-year-old children in Gaza Strip were born refugees in a 365 kilometer square open air prison where life is uninhabitable, not only because of the collective punishment and the denial of their basic rights, including their right to return, but also with their life journey that is full of flames in their sky, houses in rubbles, and them sleeping as a family in one bed, fearing to wake up the next morning in different lives. During the last military offensive on the Gaza Strip, Israel's indiscriminate and disproportionate use of force killed 253 Palestinians, including 66 children. From false assumptions about Palestine voicing their aspiration to freedom as anti-Semitic, Palestinians pointed out to the mass waves of Israeli Jewish protests chanting death to Arabs, which are institutionalized by state. The Palestinian people have been voicing their aspiration toward freedom and decolonization since '48. Since the latest popular uprising, the world is listening more to Palestinian voices, acknowledging the reality as it is the first step to arrive at the solution. Next step is actions. When seeking justice and accountability, Palestinians understand from first-hand experience that Israel's justice system is the driving force in the continued protection and entrenchment of the pervasive impunity enjoyed by the Israeli authorities. They also know that this institutionalized impunity is sustained by the international community failure to effectively ensure Israel stop the illegal situation imposed against them as per their obligation under international law. After 73 years of ongoing colonization and racial discrimination, the Palestinian people have a small glimpse of trust and hope in international law. The international community must ensure that this glimpse does not disappear. The opening of a full criminal investigation into the situation in Palestine by the Office of the Prosecutor of International Criminal Court in March 2021 is an important step in the decades-long Palestinian campaign for international justice and accountability for the Israeli war crimes and the crimes against humanity. Prosecution at the ICC may be the last resort for accountability for Palestinians, to counter Israeli impunity and to contribute to justice for Palestinian victims. If the court and the international community do not stand in the face of the ongoing political attacks and pressure, not only will the Palestinian people lose their trust in the criminal justice system as a mechanism to hold individuals accountable for committing the most serious crimes of concern to the international community as a whole, but the entire world. And while prosecution contributes to justice by holding individuals accountable and countering impunity and the recurrence of crimes, Palestinians' justice is more than that. It's in the dismantlement of the settler colonial logic that drives their displacement and dispossession and the racial discrimination they are subjected to. It's the implementation of their right to self-determination. It's their fulfillment of their right to return to their original homes. It's a future where they live in freedom and dignity. For that, the Palestinian people have long enough mobilized the international community to fulfill their obligation under international law, including by imposing immediate sanctions on Israel to stop its ongoing denial of Palestinian people from exercising their right to self-determination. Such action include an arms embargo and listing the Israeli occupying forces on the UN list of shame to prevent ongoing crimes committed against the Palestinian people, including the unnecessary and excessive use of force in the context of military offensives, suppressing peaceful protests, search and arrest operations, and at checkpoints in complete disregard for Palestinians' life. With expanding settlements enterprise, all states must align themselves with their legal obligation and prohibit their importation of goods and services originating in Israeli illegal colonial settlements across Palestine. If the oppression continues against the Palestinian people with no consequences, the foundation and purpose of the international law will fail not only the Palestinian people, but people all over the world. We are now at two paths: either the immediate implementation of countermeasures against Israel and to hold Israeli criminals who contribute to the struggle of the Palestinian people towards freedom accountable, and thereby ensuring that the rule of law is implemented, or the ongoing failure of the international community to uphold their obligation under the international law, the ongoing perpetration of crimes against the Palestinian people, and an increased frustration among Palestinians, leading them to take their rights in their own hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Ustaz Jabarin, for that compelling presentation. And I think what's most underscored by what you're saying, and I'm sure everybody here agrees, and certainly in Palestine, is that the urgency of the conditions, the urgency caused by the escalated, expanding colonization of the Israeli regime requires that, allies, Palestinians, people of conscience globally, not sit on their laurels and wait for state or international institutional actors, which are delayed for political reasons or by way of administrative bureaucracy, but to rather seek creative direct actions, whether it's creative litigation strategies, creative people's embargoes, as we've seen with the Zim ships, and otherwise to really make an impact and to help deter Israeli violence. I might add, if it's okay, that what we also need to do is until, and we don't know how long that until is, but until there is really meaningful international intervention against Israeli colonization and violence, that Palestinians must be protected and offered the means and the mechanisms for self-defense and to deter Israeli violence physically. There is no other direct mechanism of deterrence for Palestinians. You raised a lot of great points, specifically around this, the fragmented diagnosis and therefore the fragmented approach to the issue of justice and liberation for Palestinians. But what's also happened is since Oslo, and this was escalated, of course, since Oslo and the state building paradigm that was implemented, adopted by Oslo and consequently the Palestinian Authority, which also fragmented Palestinians from each other. Now, this rift we saw was healed specifically quite expressly, at least politically, if not yet completely physically, since the May 11th battles, I would say. But it hasn't been so much healed regionally. And I think this is one of the greatest threats and challenges that Palestinians face, is the isolation from their regional context, their regional situation. And that is, of course, naturally implemented by Israeli colonizer violence. And it's also excluded and prevented people in the region from accessing one of the most important, uniting, and cosmopolitan cities, once cosmopolitan cities in the region, which is Al-Quds, also known as Jerusalem. On that note, we turn it over to Professor Maruf to share his insight and considerations around Al-Quds. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lamis, and thank you very much for Professor Al-Aryan, Sami, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you and with the distinguished guests as well. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm so happy for this opportunity as well for me to speak on the issue of Jerusalem and its importance as well in this very harsh and very hard case. On Jerusalem, we know that Jerusalem, whenever Jerusalem is mentioned, usually we get to have a lot of debate and a lot of arguments and counter arguments as well, because it's quite important to note that almost everybody has got a link, some kind of a link to Jerusalem, and it's huge and it's high status for many of the followers of the three monotheistic religions as well, needs to be tackled and needs to be taken into consideration whenever we speak about Jerusalem, and whenever we have any a study on Jerusalem and its importance as well in this issue. With regarding to this issue, we need to first to note that the Palestinian issue is not only an issue of a land, and that is how Zionism actually wanted it to be. Zionism, yes, wanted the issue to be an issue that revolves around the claim of the land of Israel and the land of the Jewish people who lived in the diaspora all around the world for, according to the Zionist understanding, for 3,000 years. And then, or 2,000 years, and then they are returning to the land of Zion, according to the Zionist movement's propaganda. However, in this context, Jerusalem comes actually in the center point of this issue, even noting that the national anthem of Israel Hatikva, or the hope, actually mentions specifically mentions Jerusalem at the end when it says let us be a free people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. So the word Jerusalem comes at the end, actually, the closing part, the closing word of the whole national anthem of Israel. And this shows actually the centrality of Jerusalem in this context and this struggle. With regarding to this issue as well, with regarding to the Palestinian point of view and the Palestinian, the Arab and the Muslim point of view as well, the Arab, Muslim and Christian as well, and the Muslim, Arab and non-Arab point of view as well, the centrality of Jerusalem comes in a very important as a very important aspect in this context and in this struggle, and in this case, because it shows always that Jerusalem has to be mentioned in many themes, for example, many songs, or in many ways of dealing with this issue, whether it is politically, you take it politically, or in any other aspect of this case. So that shows how important Jerusalem is. And this tells us a very important point here, which is that neglecting the status of Jerusalem and the religious status of Jerusalem is, in my opinion, wrong in this context. Many people think that you need to neglect the religious part of seeing Jerusalem as being part of the struggle today, and as being part of the crisis in Palestine. And I don't think that this is right. I think it's wrong, because Jerusalem, whether you are actually an Israeli or a Palestinian or of any other background, you will have to speak about Jerusalem in a very if I could say, spiritual way. And this tells us a lot about the importance of the city in this case. And the Israeli and the Zionist propaganda in this issue never neglected this issue, and they concentrated on this issue. And by the way, we need to know that when the Zionists started actually to work towards building the idea of having Palestine as the national homeland for the Jewish people, they had Jerusalem in its center of the whole project. And in order to do that, they needed actually, some of the academics, for example, needed to downgrade Jerusalem in the face of Muslims as well, who were Muslims and Christians, who were the main inhabitants of the state and the city as well before the establishment of Israel, before the Nakba in 1948. So within that context, we saw a lot of academic work by Israeli academics and Zionist academics as well, who tried to downgrade the status of Jerusalem in Islam, and to show that Jerusalem has never been an important city for Muslims as well, and to say that, to claim that it has always been an important city only for the Jewish people. That is quite interesting to note. For example, I'll give some examples on this. For example, I'll give Amnon Cohen, for example, and Havalat Rusyafi as two examples on this issue. Amnon Cohen and Havalat Rusyafi are two prominent Israeli academics who tried in one of their books, many books actually, but in one of their books that was translated by by support of the Israeli Municipality of Jerusalem in 1998, they tried in a book called Jerusalem, a study in the history of the city. They tried to downgrade the status of Jerusalem in Islam. Amnon Cohen claims that Jerusalem's status in Islam has always been linked to the Torah, to the Bible. and that the Muslims during the time of Omar ibn al-Khattab, the second Muslim caliph who took over Jerusalem from the Byzantines, were actually led by the Jewish understanding of the status of the city of Jerusalem. And here comes the role of Ka'b al-Ahbar, according to Amnon Cohen. In addition to that, Lahav al-Atrus comes and starts claiming in the same book that Jerusalem has never been important for Muslims. And she takes as an example, she takes Ibn Taymiyyah, the prominent and well-known Muslim scholar of the 8th century of Hijrah, means the 14th century. The 14th century, she takes him as an example of saying that, of claiming that Jerusalem has never been important and that Mecca and Medina has always been of priority for Muslims over Jerusalem and over the city and the status as well. But this is actually wrong, because Ibn Taymiyyah himself was actually he argued many times in his books, especially the book of Fatawa, the biggest book of Ibn Taymiyyah. He many times argued that Jerusalem has a high status in Islam and it's very important for Muslims as well. In addition to that, many other scholars that have Al-Atrus takes as an example actually mentioned the importance of the city of Jerusalem and never downgraded the status of Jerusalem in Islam. Another example that is very recent example, if I could say, one of the well-known academics in Israel of today, Mordechai Kedar of the University of Bar Ilan. Mordechai Kedar is a well-known academic who speaks on TVs and in media about Jerusalem being not important at all in Al-Aqsa Mosque in Islam, and that Al-Aqsa Mosque that is mentioned in the Quran is obviously, according to him, is not the one that the Muslims believe today to be in Jerusalem. He claims that Al-Aqsa Mosque is actually in Al-Jarana village in Saudi Arabia today. That is a small village between Mecca and Taif. And he claims that according to Al-Waqidi, one of the prominent Muslim historians in the 8th century, he says that Al-Waqidi actually was the one who mentioned Al-Aqsa Mosque, and he claimed that the Prophet Muhammad actually prayed in Al-Aqsa Mosque according to Al-Waqidi, and that was during the time of Al-Jarana, or after the Battle of Hunain, at the end of the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he claims that the Muslims had mistakenly actually linked the word Masjid al-Aqsa or Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Quran with that mosque in Jerusalem, and he claims that you should go, as a Muslim, you should go to Saudi Arabia to claim your mosque there in Al-Jarana. But that is quite interesting argument, rather actually funny argument, because it shows that Mordechai Kedar has a lack of understanding of Arabic language, because Al-Waqidi was actually not speaking about the mosque that the Prophet prayed in during the night journey. He was actually trying to differentiate two mosques at his time, one at the end of the valley and one at the beginning of the valley. And the people during the time of Al-Waqidi used to pray at the closest mosque to the village of Al-Jarana, thinking that it was the place where the Prophet Muhammad prayed before he went to Mecca after the Battle of Hunain and after the Battle of Taif. So he says that the Prophet Muhammad actually never prayed in that mosque, but he prayed in the other mosque, the furthest mosque in the valley, and that was the place where the Prophet Muhammad prayed in during that day. And he says clearly about as of the mosques that the people pray in our time, it was built by one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad. It was not actually a place where the Prophet Muhammad prayed. So he was speaking about something totally different. But Mordechai Kedar comes and claims that the Muslims actually throughout 1400 years made a mistake in showing that Al-Aqsa Mosque or thinking that Al-Aqsa Mosque was the one in Jerusalem, or is the one in Jerusalem. And in addition to that, other academics in Israel comes and claim, for example, that the status of Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem was built by the Umayyads for political reasons. So all of these propagandas and all of these arguments show actually that the Israeli academia is actually working for the political body in Israel and actually trying to have a link between the Israelis and Al-Aqsa Mosque while downgrading or lower the importance of Al-Aqsa Mosque for more than 1 billion Muslims as well, not only for the Palestinians. And that shows that Jerusalem has been always a main center of this clash in this issue, and it tells us as well a lot of things about how Israel lost its battle in Jerusalem and lost its battle in the city, because since the beginning of the occupation in 1948 of the western side of the city, and in 1967 of the holy sites and the eastern side of the city, mainly the holy sites, the Holy Sepulchre Church, the mosque, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the old city of Jerusalem with all the holy sites within it. It shows us how Israel actually failed in its struggle towards imposing an idea or imposing its understanding of the story of the city and the status of the city of Jerusalem. Israel started from the beginning to try to link itself and to link the Zionist understanding and the Zionist propaganda to the city. Once by downgrading the importance of Jerusalem for Muslims, according as I mentioned in the examples that I mentioned before, and second by trying to build up a status for Jerusalem on ground. There is a problem that Israel actually is facing, has always been facing in Jerusalem since the occupation, which is the face of the city, the civilizational face of the city, and the character of the city of Jerusalem. Geographically and demographically speaking, Jerusalem has always been a Palestinian city. And it shows you exactly that from wherever from you look at the city, you will sense the Palestinian and the Arab, the Muslim, the Christian face of the city of Jerusalem. While Israel has been always trying to impose a sole Jewish character of the city of Jerusalem, it was actually the Israelis were actually, if I could say, they lost the battle in this issue. So the Israelis were trying to exclude Muslims and Christians from the city of Jerusalem and excludes the Palestinian shape of the city that connects these two elements together, the Muslim and Christian character of the city of Jerusalem, in addition, by the way, to the Jewish character of the city, which has always been welcomed in the city of Jerusalem throughout the Muslim history, since the time of Saladin until the end of the Ottoman Empire time. But the Israelis tried actually from the beginning to differentiate and to exclude the Muslim and Christian elements of the character of the city of Jerusalem. Now, here, when we look at the struggle of the Israelis for this issue, we can see that the center of the religious and social atmosphere of the city of Jerusalem, that shows you the vision of the city and the vision that demonstrates and the vision that actually dominates, the city of Jerusalem is Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy City of Jerusalem. So in this context, we can see that Jerusalem, that Israel has lost its battle in the city of Jerusalem. Why? Because until today, since 1967, whenever you look to the city of Jerusalem from the eastern side, from the Mount of Olives, whenever you look at the city of Jerusalem, the first site that you look at and the atmosphere of the city and the main scenery of the city of Jerusalem is actually the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I'm speaking here about the Dome of the Rock and the Qibli Mosque, which consists all of the Al-Aqsa enclave or Al-Aqsa Mosque, because it is actually the whole enclave of 144,000 square meters. So it's very obvious that whenever you look, the Dome of the Rock actually dominates the whole character of the city and the vision of the city. And behind it directly, there is another big dome that dominates the whole thing around it as well, which is the dome of the Holy Sepulchre Church. So there is nothing that tells you that this city is an Israeli city. Why? Because Israel tries from the beginning, has always been trying to characterize itself and to introduce itself as the Jewish state, and showing that it actually only represents the Jewish vision. But looking at the capital, between brackets, according to the Israeli understanding, the capital of the city does not actually give you the Jewish Israeli Zionist face of the city that Israel is trying to get to until today. And this is why they were trying actually to challenge this atmosphere by building their own buildings in the western side of the city, which were actually only big towers like the Tower of George V and other towers. In addition to that, they were trying actually to show a presence of the Israeli character in the city by rebuilding the Beit HaKhurba synagogue in the city of Jerusalem, which was actually built during even the time of the Ottomans. It is not new. So even when you look at this, the old pictures of the city of Jerusalem since the Ottoman period, you would find it actually. You would find the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Holy Sepulchre, the Dome of the Qibli Mosque, and the small dome of the Beit HaKhurba synagogue in the face of Jerusalem, but it does not actually show. Sorry. Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. But it does not actually differentiate or change the face of the city of Jerusalem. Demographically speaking, here, the city of Jerusalem is still, around the holy sites in Jerusalem, the status of the city, demographically speaking, is still an Arab-Palestinian status. Why? Because once you look at the statistics of the Israeli government in Jerusalem, you would find that they concentrate on all parts of the city, eastern part and the eastern side and western sides of the city of Jerusalem. And by looking at that, you would find that the Palestinian population of the city had in 1967, there were almost 24% of the city. But by the way, it is now about around 35 to 39% of the city. So after more than 50 years of occupation, actually the population, the Palestinian population of the city has increased, not decreased, in the city. And so by looking at the places where the Palestinians live, you would find that they actually live around the old city, in and around the old city of Jerusalem, in and around the holy sites of Jerusalem. So this is why the Israelis were actually trying to break this this circle of the Palestinian population that protects the holy sites of the city from all over the area around it, by penetrating this circle from the north through Sheikh Jarrah area, and from the south by Hay Silwan area. And this actually tells you a lot about what we listen today and what we hear today of the problem in Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan as well. So it's very important and it's very obvious for us to understand that the whole struggle in the city actually revolves, even demographically, revolves around the holy sites of the city. And even the Israeli authorities call this area the Holy Basin. And they had in 2007 there was a project by the Israeli municipality that was introduced to decrease the number of the Palestinians in this area seriously to as low as 12,000 or 12% people of the population of the city, but they couldn't do it. But in this context, the main aim of that project in 2007, declared in 2007, was actually to penetrate this circle that revolves around the Holy Basin, which consists of the old city of Jerusalem, including Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Holy Sepulchre Church. So
I think we have to ask you to wrap up, Professor.
Yes, I'm just finishing now. Yeah,
okay, we're a few minutes for time.
Yes, because yeah, I have 1 minute list. Yeah, because I'm just looking at the timing.
Okay.
Yeah, don't worry about the timing.
timing.
Yeah, I'm seriously looking at my time, so don't worry about it. Thank you. With regarding to this, I can say that the Israelis were actually trying to show that Israel is only an exclusive, they were trying to impose an exclusive vision of the city over the city of Jerusalem. Did Israel succeed in this issue or not? I don't think that they succeeded. I think that Israel failed in this issue, failed very much. Why? Because until today, the face of the city of Jerusalem is still Palestinian. The main aspect of the Palestinian of the city of Jerusalem is character and vision as well, and scenery is a Palestinian scenery, and it is still speaking in the language of the people of Palestine, and it still tells us the story of the people of Palestine. So I don't think that Israel has succeeded, and I don't think that they would succeed in the coming very near future. Why? Because, and I finish with this, Israel has lost its battle in Jerusalem since more than 50 years, for 54 years. So I don't think that they have the abilities now or the capabilities as well to impose their vision and to destroy the face, the character of the city of Jerusalem within these coming few years. I don't think so, and I think that the Battle of Jerusalem has definitely been lost by Israel, and it would never been successful as well. Thank you very much again for your timing, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
I am so very sorry, Professor Ahmad, for cutting you off. I don't know, I have a different timing. I think I've done this to other panelists. So your forgiveness in advance. That brilliant presentation, I imagine we could spend hours. I took so many notes, understanding the history and the maneuvering around Al-Quds. One point that you raised, I think it's very critical, especially at this time, even given the very hopeful note you've left us on, Professor Ahmad, is the role the understanding that the institutions of apartheid and colonization are not limited to the military and the physically violent, but that they rely openly and include the academic, cultural, and social sectors, which play a very direct role in the protection and advancement of colonizing violence. And perhaps that's something that can be addressed in the discussion session. If it's okay, we have a number of questions. I'd like to pose 3 questions at a time from the audience. The first is quite interesting, posed to Dr. Ahlam. How do you assess the performance of the Palestinian pro-Hamas resistance media, particularly in Gaza? How can we transform the gains? Number 2, how can we transform the gains in media and public discourse into political victories? And number 3, what do you estimate to be the challenges facing pro-Palestinian activities? And we turn that over to any of you who want to speak, keeping in mind that I think we have a few more questions in about 30 minutes, if I'm accurate in my timing this time.
I guess I get the first question right about the performance of Hamas lately. I think Hamas overall has been actually performing better with every round and evolving themselves. And we could talk about several things. I mean, if we are only discussing the narrative or focusing on the narrative that is aimed at the West, right? Because you have to think about all the multiple audiences that one can focus on in any media campaign. So if we are talking about addressing the West, I do believe that one important aspect that Hamas did right was changing their charter a few years ago, because it had been widely employed actually to perpetuate the terrorist, Israeli Hasbara, narrative, and that all Hamas wants to do is throw Jews into the sea and to kill as many Jews as possible. So I think that was a very crucial step actually in the right direction. In the last round, I would argue that an important narrative, not only on the part of Hamas, that we have activists been focusing on forging, is the fact that the United States government considered Hamas a terrorist group. But that's not necessarily the rest of the world, right? The majority of the world actually considers Hamas either as a resistance group or as a political party that won the election, which was testified to be, very fair elections by many people who witnessed the elections at that time, including a former US President Carter. So I think it's very important that we focus on that aspect. And one of the problems that I faced personally, I had to do a lot of teach-ins, like out of a sudden, the Antioch University, UCR, our own university had been asking me to participate in teach-ins, media interviews, etc. And unfortunately, I saw a lot of the activists who are supposed to be, like progressive, would throw Hamas under the bus before they even open their mouth. And I think that's very problematic. Like even before you ask them to do anything or they feel the pressure, they immediately detach themselves and say, and I pushed back, against this. And I had to actually confront some even famous names. And I say, why do we have to throw Hamas under the bus when we have a very clear evidence of state-sponsored terrorism that we should focus on? When we talk about the asymmetry in power, the fact that Hamas was forced to engage in a kind of self-defense mechanism, the siege, etc. So you leave everything and then you attack Hamas. So we have to push back, and we have to really reframe the narrative. So part of it is Hamas, and of course I saw a question also about the Palestinian Authority, but that's a different total aspect. But a dominant narrative in media, even what is considered progressive mainstream media in the United States, like NPR, for example, or PBS, has been this focus on the war between Hamas and Israel. The war between, some people might think it's a progression actually, because in the past it would be Hamas terrorism. So it's a little bit now tilted as a war, between two equal parties. But I think that's what I would like to say, that we have to focus on shifting that narrative and talk about Hamas is a symptom of the colonization of Palestine. If we don't have colonization of Palestine or Hamas attacks, or missiles, it's a very legal by international law to, you have the right to self-defense, even with military, force. So I will stop at this and then let others pick other questions. Thank you.
Who else would like to address any of the questions? I can restate them as
Look, Lamis, world is changing.
Mm-hmm.
We have to see that well. Also here, our society is changing too, as part of that. Palestinian Authority, I think, expired long time ago. And the old generation, they don't want to accept this fact, and they try to push back, not to allow the young generation to engage smoothly, democratically, to play their role. But the young generation, they are leading in the streets. The question is how to let them also engaging and leading on other levels. That's an issue. This will help Palestinians to strengthen their effort, to strengthen their society, to strengthen their struggle against oppression, against persecution, against occupation, against apartheid. I think this is the main thing that we have to take. But unfortunately, the case is not like that. In my point of view, I think we are in the last stage of the transitional time. Things is changing for sure. Things will not stay as it is for long. Even the international community to accept the Palestinians' narrative, the Palestinian resistance is there also. It's there. And we see the difference between before and today. When it comes to the media coverage, when it comes to the even the words and even the language that's used by officials, diplomats, or others. Why? Because I think everyone fed up with what's happened, and it has been happening since so long, decades now, more than 7 decades. I think it's a time for a change. The question is how to shorten the time of suffering, and to build on what's going on, which strategy that you have to build, to engage with the solidarity groups and solidarity movement, let me say, over the world. This is, I think, an issue. There are many things. But what's promising, to be honest with you, really, the people, those they are in streets in Jerusalem and defended, Al-Aqsa, they are not religious, all of them. Most of them, maybe they are not fasting, to be honest with you, but they are willing and ready to die for Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa and their city. That's an issue. I think this conflict, it's not just an issue of mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. This is a chemistry. I think the Israelis, they don't understand the chemistry of this society, that the people, they are ready, to fight for their space also in Damascus Gate, and not to let, the Israelis close this space before them. This is an issue. Sometimes you feel it. And our people is bigger than their leadership, to be honest with you. I have a full promise, and let me say full hope that things will change. And if there is one has to concern from a long-term future, not us, to be honest with you. That's the case. Things reached the peak. And the great thing is the new generation is united, to be honest with you. We feel it. United everywhere, and things are changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ustaz, for that brilliant and inspiring intervention. And I think that's exactly right, that this chemistry is that hope and that motivation, which increases actually even the physical strength of each individual and is able to transcend the boundaries and all of these obstacles. I think that you raised a really critical point for the people who are watching, especially those of us who are not able to be in Palestine and take direct action role, that given that this is a pivotal moment, because this exchange is allowing us the space to really consider how do we place the voices and the physical people, the actual people who are leading on the ground, into spaces of political, cultural, social, intellectual leadership to challenge far more powerfully the dominant narratives. We have a few outstanding questions that I will add for others to address. If you feel like a question has been answered sufficiently, you might want to consider the following two that we have. How do you assess the performance, what are the challenges currently to taking Israel to the ICC and holding it to account is one. And number two, how have the rights of Palestinians been impacted by Palestinian quote unquote security cooperation? On this point, I would ask that we change this term, because the discursive struggle is important, to perhaps colonial cooperation instead. التنسيق الاستعماري مش التنسيق الأمني. I'll open the floor, of course, to whomever wants to answer these two added questions along with the three we initially posed.
Can you repeat the first one?
Of course, yes. It is, what are the challenges that are preventing taking Israel to the ICC? And we know that it is being taken, but also to holding it to account. Perhaps Ustaz Jabarin wants to answer that. I don't think people will tire of hearing from you.
Okay, no problem. I think we are in our way to that. Investigation is opened. This is not confidential to say that they started. We engage with them actively. Because of that, we are under the attack and smear campaigns. We will not give up, and we will not step back. This is for sure. For us, it's not a job. But it takes time, to be honest with you. Maybe some people, they think that maybe the ICC, Palestinian officials, Palestinian state, they haven't done what they have to do, but they did, to be honest with you. To be fair, because we are familiar with what's going on. And also the civil society is working hardly on everything. More than that, the ICC is not looking at the war crimes only, but also taking into account the crimes against humanity, like apartheid. And their scope is open. And this is a very important thing. Some people, they ask questions about the new prosecutor. I think the new prosecutor will defend the professionality and the independence of the office and the ICC. Palestine is hard for everyone over the world because we are really a real test for the principles of international law and for the institutions. Because of that, they dislike us. Because of that, some of the states, they try to push, back and not to let Palestinians to engage here or there or to address their case at the international institutions because it's a hard test. It's not easy for them. This is Israel, supported unconditionally by the US. And here, it cornered them. When it comes to the ICC, this is an issue. Because of that, the UK, they used to push Palestine not to accede to the ICC statute, and they offered them to vote for them at the Security Council, but to give a guarantee that they will not engage and they will not accede to ICC for next 25 years. This is information. This is not analysis. And also under Sarkozy, it's the same. That's the case. But I think now we are in that. And I have a big hope that the ICC will play its role. Not because they are sympathize with the Palestinians. No, this is the law. At the end, there is facts and there is law. I know that there is politics part of this, part of the chemistry of these things. But at the end, they are defending the image of the ICC, because by standing by this case strongly, they are defending the existence of the ICC. That's the case, because the image of the ICC is just going after the poor countries, Africa, and this is now before them. There is a big fish, and they have to show that they are serious. They are independence and they are respecting, the principles of the statute. Thank you.
Ms. Lamis, can I add something? Yes. Yes.
Sorry.
Can I add something on one point?
Absolutely.
Yes, I totally agree with Dr. Shawan, and I would like to add something very important here. A lot of people, I've been hearing a lot of people on the social media actually trying to mock the idea of going to the ICC and saying that Israel is always above the law and so forth and so on and so forth. But that actually is not the case. Israel actually feels afraid of going to the ICC, and we have a point, and we have an example of a case that was about to be started, actually investigation by the ICC, and the Israelis just pulled up, on which is the issue of Al Khan Al Ahmar area between Jerusalem and Jericho. The Israelis' highest court, the High Court of Israel, actually gave a ruling to derive everything and displace the people in Al Khan Al Ahmar area to other places a few months ago, when the prosecutor in the ICC actually just gave one hint, saying that this case could be opened as for investigation by the ICC, and Benjamin Netanyahu directly ordered to postpone the application of this of the Israeli High Court. And this shows how important is going to the ICC is. And this actually, I wanted to give this example in order to make sure that going to the ICC is not actually an issue of playing with words or going and playing with time. It is actually something that Israel does not want to happen, and it harms the Israeli propaganda a lot. So I think that going to the ICC should be actually one of the main ideas that the Palestinians should go for. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maruf. I think maybe we can move on to a few other questions. I would just like to add, I think the one thing is to not rely on the ICC, and to underscore your point is that the US conditioned a lot of support to the PLO on not pursuing a claim before the ICC. But I have a couple of questions, some of which are to you, Professor Maruf, and to Josh Rubner. I'll combine those to you, Josh. In light of the fact that the two-state solution is dead, how can we monopolize and capitalize on the moment to make political gains in the US and to stand against Israeli apartheid and demand changes from political elites, or I would say policymakers? That's for you, Josh. Would you like to take that?
Sure, and if I can just add in quickly on the ICC, especially the U.S. policy angles, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is that the ICC is not like the Security Council, where the United States can simply use its undemocratic veto to stop the investigations from taking place. But the bad news is, of course, the U.S. has been leveraging a whole ton of political pressure against the ICC and against the PLO from going forward to the ICC. So the Trump administration actually imposed sanctions, excuse me, on members of the ICC. Those sanctions were reversed by the Biden administration, but the Biden administration still holds to the narrative that the Palestinians have no legitimate rights to take their cases to the ICC. And in fact, what you mentioned, Lamis, just a minute ago, the PLO office cannot be reopened in Washington, D.C. as long as Palestinians are pursuing cases in the ICC. So we see a lot of political pressure being exerted on both the ICC and the Palestinians to drop these cases, which is an indication of just how important they are. If they didn't mean anything, then the US and Israel wouldn't be going through all this to try to stop it. Let me say something quickly on the colonial aspects that you mentioned, and I like your reframing of that, Lamis, because in the Palestine papers that were leaked to Al Jazeera during the Bush administration, there's a very, very telling account of a meeting between the U.S. security coordinator, as he was known, and the former chief Palestinian negotiator, Saeb Erekat. And in that meeting, Dr. Erekat confronts the U.S. security coordinator about how the U.S. Is standing up these presidential security forces for Mahmoud Abbas, and that he knows that torture is being committed against Palestinians by these U.S. trained forces, and the U.S. security coordinator just kind of laughs off the torture. And we should also remember how after Hamas won the 2006 legislative elections, there was a CIA trained force under Dahlan that invaded Gaza with Egyptian coordination to stoke the civil war. So there's been a tremendous amount of US intervention into the internal quote unquote security affairs of Palestinians designed to reinforce the Oslo rubric of divide and rule and keeping Palestinians within this very tight box. So how do we make political gains in the US? I think we keep doing what we're doing. I think it is working. I think we keep getting elected to Congress people who understand the intersectionality of the oppression of the Palestinian people at the hands of Israel and the oppression that many different communities of color face in the United States. I think the solidarity we're seeing from members of Congress like Representative Cori Bush, who cut her teeth on the streets of Ferguson as an activist for racial justice and is now standing firmly behind Palestinian rights, is an indication that aligning Palestinian rights with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party is the way to go.
Thank you, Josh. Do we have a moment to pose one final question to Professor Maruf, or should we go into closing statements? If somebody could advise, that would be great. In the interim, while I wait for the answer, because maybe you could incorporate it into your closing remarks, Professor, I'm going to combine the two questions that were posed to you into one along the same lines for Josh, which is what are the important next steps to take to protect the sanctity of Al-Aqsa and Al-Quds, and how do we leverage Israeli, the studies that reveal Israeli myths about the history of Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa in doing so, particularly as regards the Bible that was found by Finkelstein and Silberman. We are asked to close out the session with 2 to 2.5 minutes per panelist in the same order as we began. Not hearing back, perhaps Professor Umar, you can combine for 2.5 minutes, including the question that I just posed. Closing remarks, Dr. Ahlam.
Right. Well, I just want to emphasize that we are forging forward. We are not gonna submit to the constant attempts by the United States, Israel, and other imperialist powers to pacify, de-radicalize the movement, even in online spaces. And I wanted to just mention that in academia, we are under, of course, double pressure to actually either do that, de-radicalize our teaching and our research and our focus on Palestine, or to silence it totally. And there are, of course, a lot of examples that I couldn't, share with you. For example, Zoom now, I didn't focus on Zoom, but Zoom and its suppression in academia of classrooms that actually present the Palestinian narratives to our students in the United States. A big example is what happened to the Ahmed program at San Francisco State University, for example, and Dr. Rabab Abdel Hadi, when she tried to, add one panelist who's Layla Khaled to one of the panelists, and her whole class was taken down when she tried to put the class on YouTube, on Facebook, everywhere. It was taken down, in a concerted effort, of course, as a result of the mass reporting by the cyber unit and its trolls. But in spite of that, she was able still to do the session. She was still able to continue with the work. And I'm just calling for not only activists, but actually scholars you know, the producers of knowledge, especially Palestinians and their allies, to think again, to think differently about knowledge production. It's not sufficient now to only produce films, documentaries or books or articles that would be contained mainly in the ivory tower. We have to take the narrative and release it and liberate it from those domains into a more, you know, popular and mass domains for the whole world really to interact with those freely. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ahlam. Josh, your closing remarks, please.
Thanks so much, Lamis. I think I'll take these 2 minutes to kind of push back a little bit on Professor Maruf and him being sanguine about Israel's failure to Judaize Jerusalem, because I think what's taking place right now is incredibly, incredibly important for us to keep our eyes on in terms of Silwan especially. On June 9th, about 100 families in the Bustan neighborhood of Silwan received notices that they had to demolish their own homes within 21 days, or else the Jerusalem municipality will come in and demolish the homes for them and also fine them for not demolishing themselves. So what we're talking about right now is the ethnic cleansing of approximately 1,550 Palestinians in Silwan. This, I believe, would be the single largest act of ethnic cleansing to take place in Jerusalem since 1967, since Israel's destruction of the Maghrebi Quarter in the Old City, to make way for that huge plaza that we see in front of the Western Wall today. It's a massive ethnic cleansing campaign, and it's being done to create what Israel calls Gan HaMelech, which is the park of the king, because this is where Israel believes that King David had his capital 3,000 years ago, and Israel's been digging underground for decades to find artifacts from King David's supposed reign in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago. And according to Israeli archaeologists, they haven't found one single shred of historical evidence. And in fact, Israeli archaeologists are criticizing how this archaeology is being done, because they're digging vertically instead of horizontally, which supposedly diminishes the importance of any archaeological evidence found. But I say this to point out how this digging under the ground in Silwan is actually demolishing the foundations of a lot of Palestinian homes. So if you look at Palestinian homes in Silwan right now, you will see huge cracks in the foundation. So these houses might be demolished because of this,
right.
Even if they're not demolished. So it's incredibly a difficult time in Jerusalem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the urgency can't be overstated. Thank you for that, Josh. Ustaz Shahwan, your closing remarks.
The future is for justice, no doubt of that.
Yes.
I do believe strongly about this. Power is a changeable thing in history, and you can't build your existence on one main element called power and force. And standing behind Palestinians, it's not just a Palestinian call. It's not standing because they are Palestinians. You are standing behind the principles that the humanity do believe about it. And keeping Palestine as an exceptional case, I think it has to concern everybody who does believe about international law and rule of law, because there is two ways: rule of law or rule of jungle. Those they do believe about rule of law, I think they have to take actions and to stand strongly behind these principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Ustazna. Professor, closing remarks and maybe a moment to answer final question posed to you as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Lamis. Thank you very much for everybody. I am really appreciating all what everybody says here with regarding to the issue of Jerusalem and Israel's actions in Jerusalem. We need to actually ask a question: is Israel capable of applying an ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem today? If we ask this question if we have asked this question in 1967, we would have said yes, they would have been able. But now there are many elements in the equation that needs to be taken into consideration, and I don't think that Israel will be able to apply any ethnic cleansing on the mass way that they did in the past. Our duty, actually, with regarding to this issue, is to work academically towards showing how if I could say, how weak is the Israeli propaganda on regarding to the issue of Jerusalem, and we need to work towards actually raising this issue and applying statistically and quality research on this issue in the universities of the world in order to understand the Palestinian problem and the Palestinian point of view towards Jerusalem. And this is something that we need to tackle academically first, and then we need to take it on other levels such as media and other things. So I hope that we can take this opportunity in order to get more research and more deep research in Jerusalem issue, and publish a lot more than what Israel is trying actually to publish, because we need to challenge the Israeli narrative with regarding to the issue of Jerusalem. Thank you very much for this opportunity again. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And I think that the summary everybody agrees with is that whether it's in precedent or in practice of its diplomacy by brute force, militarization and violence, Israel is of direct concern and impact to all people of the world, and therefore the Palestinian problem is actually rather a global solution for peace and safety for all people, which means that the rest of this conference is just as important. We have next at 8 p.m. local Istanbul time, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the next session entitled Challenging Apartheid in Palestine, Reclaiming the Narrative, Formulating a Vision, with quite a few number of notables whom I personally love, two of which are from South Africa. Thank you again to CIGA, to all of the panelists, and to Dr. Sami Al-Arian. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Salamat.
شكرا. يعطيكم العافية.